Rahim. I begin in the name of the God of the entire humanity, whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is forever. The title of the presentation that we both together worked out is Playing God: How and Why Has a Moderate and Peaceful Religion of Islam Come to be Associated with Violence and Extremism? The way I will make an attempt to clarify my understanding on the subject before you is that I'll first speak on the question, why do we claim, on what basis, that Islam is a peaceful, peace-loving religion? Then I'll go on to explain as to why some Muslims believe that it is quite the otherwise. And then I'll try to give my understanding of what exactly went wrong. And finally, I will give a few suggestions as to how the situation can be corrected. The first thing, why do we claim that Islam is a religion of peace? You know, it's always possible that people belonging to a group, a community, or an ideology have wishful thinking about their ideology, even though it doesn't stand for it. So let me tell you that our religion carries the title Islam, which means submission, but which also means peace. We submit to the Almighty, and as a consequence, we get peace from inside, and we become ambassadors and champions of peace for the outside world. Our greetings for each other, for Muslims as well as non-Muslims, is Assalamu alaikum. That is, peace be upon all of you. Don't expect anything except peace from us. We wish well for you and for everybody else. Our book from the Almighty, the Quran, clarifies that taking life of an individual, Muslim or non-Muslim, is as huge, big a crime as if one has killed the entire humanity. Likewise, saving a life is as big a virtue as if one has saved the entire mankind. The Almighty tells us in the Quran that if somebody is doing something wrong to you, is being evil, evil needs to be repelled with what is good, with what is virtuous. So the idea that if somebody slaps on one cheek, you offer the other one, is exactly what is mentioned in the Quran as well. Idfa billati hiya ahsan. If somebody has done something wrong, repel it, respond to it with a behavior which is virtuous, good. That's the ideal. The Quran tells us, binds us believers to be always fair, to be always just, not just when one is taking decisions in the capacity of a judge, but in every aspect of life, and goes on to clarify that even if there is somebody who you think is your enemy, it should not incline, his enmity should not incline you to be unfair. It tells us, the book tells us, that when we speak, we should be fair. That is, we cannot make an unfair statement as believers. The Quran says, whoever wants to believe is most welcome to believe. Whoever doesn't want to believe, it's his or her prerogative. Nobody can be forced to accept and adopt a faith and abandon the other. This is a world which the Almighty has created for a purpose of trial, and it is important that this trial should go on in a manner every human enjoys freedom. You take away freedom, and the whole purpose of trial is lost. Uh, the Quran, in some passages, has praised some non-Muslims lavishly. And last but not the least, the Quran tells us that the entire humanity is a family. We all belong to one fraternity because of two important reasons. Our Creator is one. We all humans have been created by one God, and our parents are one. We all have proceeded from Adam and Eve, and therefore human beings are brothers and sisters of each other, and they should live as a family. All that I've mentioned is mentioned in the Quran, which gives many of us Muslims a very strong reason to believe and to say and to let others know that the religion that we belong to is a peaceful religion, peace-loving religion, which promotes tolerance, cohesion, coexistence with mutual respect. However, and this is a very big however, there are some Muslims who think that that's not the case. It's not true. And there, in their opinion, is a constant, ongoing, perennial enmity, animosity with the others, with non-Muslims. They very strongly believe that we should live in this world in a manner that we Muslims are together as brothers and sisters, and the rest of the world is our enemy. Now, why do they believe that way? Honestly, one of the problems that proper communication doesn't take place is that we don't talk to each other. And the reason why we don't talk to each other properly is that we do not want to face certain realities unless you frankly and honestly put on the table everything that is there on the subject. You will not be able to do justice with it. The first part of my presentation that I've presented, some people would say it's a grossly one-sided understanding, and you have missed out on certain very important points which, if they were presented honestly, then your presentation would have appeared dishonest, not properly doing justice with the message of Islam. So, Muslims who think that the reality is otherwise, they come up with their own understanding on the basis of certain principles and statements that again are found in the Quran. One understanding or one basis of understanding of this behavior attitude that Muslims must not live peacefully with non-Muslims is that they believe that the Quran tells them that Islam, the message of God, the final word that was revealed on Prophet Muhammad, God's mercy be on him, has come to dominate over the entire globe. Every inch of the globe, not just intellectually, but politically, militarily. So there are many Muslims, I would not like to believe most Muslims, but there are many, I can assure you, who have this very strong understanding, yearning, dream in their hearts that sooner or later we will make sure that the entire globe comes within the command and control of the Islamic rule, for which we have to undertake jihad, which is something that is a part of the expectation of faith that the Almighty has from every Muslim. And for that purpose, they present certain verses. and those verses are recited, and you can imagine that for a believer, when the word of God is presented, nothing else is more important. The second accompanied reason is that they say that the Quran itself is telling believers to despise non-believers, to not make them friends. They're not worthy of it. In fact, they're worthy of us hating them. If at all, sometimes we will apparently respect them, well, it would be just because of the occasion, because we are under pressure. We have no other possibility choice. But the right behavior is that don't make them your friends. Keep this understanding clearly in your minds and hearts that they are your enemies and they've got to be subjugated. They also believe that, as I said, for the purpose of ensuring that the all-important agenda of ensuring Islam's dominance over the entire world, we need to fight non-Muslims. And for that purpose, they also sometimes quote Quranic verses which are clearly stating, kill them. Kill them wherever you find them. فَاقْتُلُوا الْمُشْرِكِينَ حَيْثُ ثَقِفْتُمُوهُمْ. That's what they recite from the Quran. And attached to this understanding is also a very strong understanding that if you are a Muslim, you can preach, you must preach to non-Muslims your faith so as to convert them to Islam. But don't ever allow them to preach to you, lest you should become a non-Muslim, and if that happens, then the only fate that is going to await you is your death. If you become an apostate and you leave your faith after having been a Muslim, then you have to be killed. As simple as that. And there are many other understandings, but the last one that I'm mentioning is that this faith of ours is the faith of God. The book, Quran, is God's book. The Prophet, God's mercy be on him, is God's messenger. Nobody can dare talk against them. If somebody talks against them in a manner that we believe is blasphemous, we just get rid of these people. So that is another understanding. So I have mentioned before you only a few features of what the understanding of some Muslims, many Muslims is, and that understanding too is also, in their view, based on the Quranic text. Now, you may well ask me, what's going on? You know, the first part of your presentation was based on the Quran, and the second part of the presentation is also based on the Quran. Now, that's what brings me to my third part of presentation. What is wrong with this understanding? Where has it gone wrong? Am I allowed to just finish my presentation here and go?
Well, you proposed the punishment for that, yeah.
Right. So you see, it's a problem, it's a difficulty, which honestly not just Muslims, but also non-Muslims should be able to work out, come to grips with. Now, very briefly, obviously it's a long discussion, but I'll be as brief as is possible. Why have things gone wrong? Why is it that the two different versions of Islam that I've presented before you seem so contradictory? The reason why it has happened is that many Muslims have not read and understood the Quran properly. You see, the Quran is not a book like other books, wherein you will have chapters for different topics, so that you would expect from a book on religion to begin with, for example, faith, belief in God, prayers, and so on. Far from that. This book, from A to Z, in totality, is first and foremost describing the saga of the messenger of God. He was entrusted with a mission by the Almighty. According to the Quran, whether somebody believes the Quran to be God's word or not, but let's first try to understand what the Quran is saying. The Quran is presenting its message in a manner that it is describing the prophetic mission, the saga of the messenger, wherein he did what the Almighty asked him to do, and what he asked him to do was exactly what he asked the earlier messengers to do as well. The Quran tells us that the men who were chosen by God to receive his message and to deliver it to people were called Anbiya, Nabi, and I translate it as prophets. But within Anbiya, prophets, there was a subset of prophets who were given the status of Rasul, Rusul, messengers. These messengers were the people who, whenever they would come to their nation to deliver God's message, and in most of the cases, they would come to a population which would be isolated from the rest of the world. I'm talking about the history of humans when that's what the case was. There was very little communication, and means of transportation were very ordinary. So each messenger would come to his nation with a clear mandate, and that is, believe and accept this message or face God's punishment. Why? Very briefly. Why? Because normally, generally speaking, the pattern is, the rule is, that you are free to do whatever you want to, but not that you're not going to be held accountable. But you will be held accountable in the next life, not here. This life is a life of freedom. This life is a life of trial. However, in a few rare cases, the Almighty chose to send his messengers, and he gave them a clear mandate that you tell your nations, your people, that this message has come to implement God's will, his decision, right in this world. The manner is going to be done in the next life for everybody. But for a few people, in order for this reality that there's going to be another life, the Almighty demonstrated in a smaller scale, in the case of some nations, the fact that if people are going to turn evil, they will have to face the consequences of it. So as a consequence of this, this policy, this plan, the Almighty sent his messengers. They delivered the message. Their nations, in most of the cases and in large numbers, rejected the message, and not in a day or two, but after a very long period of time. In the case of Noah, after 950 years, after it got declared by the Almighty that the message has been communicated unmistakably, clearly, and no person who is rejecting it has any justifiable reasons for it. Now, I am telling you that the deadline has reached, and this nation doesn't deserve to survive anymore. And therefore, my punishment is going to visit this nation. In the earlier cases, in the cases of the earlier nations, this happened in the form of one natural calamity or another. The Quran is replete with mentions of these stories. Not many stories, a few stories. In actual fact, there are 6 messengers whose stories have been repeated over and over again. Noah, Hud, Saleh, Lot, Shoaib, Moses. May God's mercy be on all of them. And their stories have been repeated so many times that an ordinary reader has a justifiable question. Why is the same story repeated over and over again? The answer is very simple. Because it was through the mention of these stories that the Almighty wanted to tell the people who were facing the message of the last messenger that, look here, if you are going to do likewise, you will face the consequences likewise. And therefore, better mend your ways, or else you're going to be destroyed as well. So that's what the Quran has made so very unmistakably clear, that an ordinary reader of the Quran also cannot miss this theme. It's the predominant theme of the Quran. As I said, the Quran from A to Z is talking about the saga of the Messenger of God. It does mention universal principles as well. It does mention God's law, Sharia as well. But that is described within the description of this, as I said, the biggest theme. So, what happened was that in the case of the last messenger, the deadline came. And when the deadline from the Almighty comes, the people who have rejected faith have to meet with their faith. And that is exactly what happened in their case as well. However, there was one difference. And the difference was that the Almighty's punishment could either come in the form of natural calamities, or it could come in the form of the military might of the companions of the Prophet. The Quran itself clarifies that in the case of the last Prophet, it were the swords of his companions that shall be employed to inflict the Almighty's divine punishment on his enemies. This is not what I'm saying on my own. The Quranic words are absolutely clear about it, that this is a punishment which is going to be inflicted upon these people who have rejected the messenger. So, for example, the Quran mentions in one particular passage when it's describing a famous battle, the Battle of Badr, which was the first installment of the Almighty's punishment that visited those who rejected the last messenger. The Quran says, "Falam taqtuluhum." Be clear, you didn't kill them. You didn't kill them. "Walakinna Allaha qatalahum." Instead, it was God who killed them. This statement to me actually has another dimension. The Almighty is actually asking, you didn't kill them. How can you kill them? You are not allowed to kill. Nobody is allowed to kill. You were used by the Almighty as a tool for His punishment to be inflicted. In another passage, the Quran says, يُعَذِّبْهُمُ اللَّهُ بِأَيْدِيكُمْ. God is going to punish them through your hands. So, what happened, unfortunately, was what was meant to be an era-specific message meant to be applicable to a particular nation that received the Almighty's message through His messenger unmistakably, clearly and directly, for which reason they became eligible to be killed through divine punishment. Those verses were generalized, universalized, and my goodness, if that is what your understanding is, I can tell you, you simply cannot stop people from being what they are. Why would they listen to you? Why would they listen to me? When their God is telling them that these people are worthy of our hatred, they need to be destroyed. Well, there were people who rejected God's message. And when that stage arrived, they were actually worthy of the Almighty's damnation. And all those verses are relevant uh, to that particular scenario. But you generalize it and you had it. You simply cannot stop it. So, finally, what I'm saying is that if at all there is any hope that the situation can be redeemed and corrected, it is only through the correct reading and understanding of the Quran. Now, some people might say that, who on earth are you to give us sermons on Islam? I mean, we know better. Our scholars have done their research for years and decades and centuries. Well, that is why I believe that we need to do two things. First and foremost, urge all Muslims, believers, that they must use their head, their intellect, which is what the Quran tells to every believer. You must read the Quran yourself and use your intellect, because you are responsible for your understanding before the Almighty, A. And B, do a comparative study of the different narratives. Let's take the call it extremist terrorist narrative, and let's see what it is based on. Let's read verses and let's look at the other narrative, and let's find out which of the two narratives is actually what seems to be God's intent, God's message. The last thing that I would want to say is that the reason why I believe my narrative would hopefully prevail in a scenario where there's going to be an objective study of both or many narratives is a simple Quranic principle, quite apart from other factors. A simple Quranic statement, and that is God cannot contradict himself. The reason why the Quran is to be believed as God's word, according to the Quran, is that there are no contradictions in the Quran. So when my dear brothers, militant brothers, go to start with a mission to start killing people, I want to tell them that kill them later, but first take care of your own faith. Your faith is at stake. When you are taking action to kill others, your Quran has become contradictory. It is telling you to not kill anyone. You simply cannot. You take a life and you become such a huge, big criminal that it is as if you've killed the entire mankind. So that's the way out. We need to reach out to people, Muslims, non-Muslims, together. We need to read the Quran, read it with an open mind, read the different interpretations, narrative that are emerging out of it. Honest to God, there could be no third narrative. You know, people who just want to wish as Muslims that Islam is a very peaceful, peace-loving religion. Why? Because that's what we want it to be. It really holds no water. It really carries no weight. Either the ideology would turn out to be absolutely peaceful, strongly grounded in its own teachings and text, or it will turn out to be peace-hating, violent, and extremist if we accept the other point of view. I'm thankful to God that I have been able to complete my presentation within half an hour.
Yeah. Well, indeed, you have actually precisely half an hour allocated time you've used up, and thank you so much for that, which means that we will have plenty of time for discussion and debate. I'm sure a lot of people will want to contribute to that. Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. I mean, it's a very difficult, very challenging topic, of course, as I said at the beginning, and what's particularly encouraging for me, the initial comment on this, is that we have you have taken an approach which I certainly approve of, which is personally as a motto, that the charity begins at home. We look at ourselves, our own situation first, our own issues, acknowledge that there are tensions, there are problems, there are reasons inherent within our own sort of way of looking at our religion and how we look at it or interpret or understand it, that I suppose it would sense help others to create the misperception that we dislike afterwards, etc. So on that basis, I think, having said that, I mean, there are all kinds of other reasons I think we can also explore in terms of how other people who are not so friendly with Islam or Muslims, etc., create mischievous sort of reasons as well on top of our own ones that we have created for ourselves. But I think beginning with ourselves is quite important, and I think what you have laid out on the table, and I whispered into him ears actually at the beginning, that this is Buckinghamshire New University in Wycombe in the United Kingdom. So please feel free to express your thoughts and reflections as openly, as frankly as you possibly can.
And I took your whisper very seriously.
And in the way that you might not wish to do in Pakistan. But here, I will be disappointed that if you used any sort of restraint in expressing what you really want to say. Because this is a safe space for us. This is the whole essence of CCMI. So over to you for discussion and purpose. And I know that Brother Hugh's got to go, so you hand up. You want to say your.
Forgive me for having to
of course,
dash. But just a very brief comment. It becomes poignantly evident to me as a Christian that Christianity has had the same sort of struggle, that in Christendom it managed, if you like, to forget its law of love, that everything, all of Jesus' teaching is about love God and your neighbour, and took up arms for the same sort of reasons, quoting the same sort of texts. And that... Yes, sir.
Shall I bring them on later on?
Yeah. And that the choice seems to be the same sort of thing. And my own perception is about examining my own heart and recognise that within my own heart there are these tensions, the temptation towards dysfunctional behaviour and demonising others, and the consequence, the horrendous consequence of that, and the call to love that which is different and which I don't understand, to love all people. So I suppose that was just my comment, that this is something that Christianity's been through, continues in some places to struggle with, and that I believe this is a problem in the human heart, every human heart, and that where the choice is towards dysfunctional behaviour, religion is used to interpret its own scriptures in a perverse way.
Right.
And so I would just leave that. This is our choice. Which side are we going to be on? I know, as for me, for my house, we choose peace. So bless you and thank you.
Bless
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And so thankfully, very large number, huge percentage of people choose to be on the right side of that interpretation.
Yes.
There's always a small number who create problems and challenges, but they're more than enough for us to worry about. No, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We're at the same meeting.
Yes.
Are you at the same meeting? Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, one person left earlier because there's been a death actually had a message that somebody has died, and the person who left at the time was vice chairman of the mosque committee, who have to then do the necessary in these circumstances. Yeah. Okay. Right, Imam Sultan.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank Dr. Khalid again for coming for the second time and sharing his valuable thoughts in CCMR. Thank you. I agree with many of the things which you said, although I joined the debate. As you just said, obviously the views, you said the majority of the Muslims, and mainly of mostly of the Muslims, I really sort of not agree with that, because what I believe that here in the UK, it's not the mostly people, or it's a minor of sort of people which are in a minority. There are very few people who have carried these sort of views, whether in all faiths, who have the extreme views and think that that's the only way forward is to dominate and this sort of thing. It's very small people who are in there, and those small people, I think, they said evil doesn't prevail more with those evil people. It prevails because of the other people staying silent, quiet. And obviously we are, CCMR is one of the platforms, we are trying to get together and be together. And other, in the mosques as well, we have these, interfaiths, we have dialogues and open days, we have these sort of things to work these people. So, in here we don't say that most people, very minor people are sort of working towards this, and we are trying to, work, so intensively try to, challenge we're facing at the moment.
Right.
And secondly, which we mentioned that in the Quran, it's only 6 prophets you mentioned in the Quran stories. I mean, there are many other prophets like Abraham, who is the father of the 3 Abrahamic faiths. His story is mentioned very widely. Many of the various in the Quran. Joseph, for instance, God calls him the Asal Qasas, the best of the stories. Many of the stories that the Quran is mentioned, not only 6, I believe many of the ways Quran is mentioned.
Right.
Thank you,
Can I
Sultan. Yeah,
respond?
sure, of course, yes. Right.
If I said most, I take my word back. Sometimes in your exuberance you mention words which probably you shouldn't, but I did want to say many. I don't want to create an impression that it's a tiny minority. You know what? The extremists who turn terrorists and militants, I see them divided into 2 parts. One group is ideologically extremist and potentially militant. Obviously, perception can always be different, and I'm talking from my understanding of what's happening in my society. Many what you call practicing Muslims have that ideology, which is what alarms me. There are organizations which are seemingly very peaceful, peace-loving. They are a part of the mainstream society of Pakistan. They've turned into political parties as well. But if you read their literature, it's written there that it is a part of my mission that I make sure that this ideology dominates. And mind you, again, I'm saying not intellectually. I'm sure everybody has a right to have a dream that your ideology dominates. Why not? But one way of doing it is through exchange of views, through putting across your understanding and letting others say what their understanding is. But here the understanding is through use of their military might. Why we are not doing it according to their understanding? Because right now we are not equipped. And some of them, when they get this perception that we are now equipped, they turn terrorists. So that's one thing that I want to say. If you are telling me that in the British society most Muslims are not like that, and it's a tiny minority, I'm delighted. It's a good news. And I hope that one day I also give you the same news about Pakistan. The second thing is, the brief answer to the second one. The 6 messengers that I mentioned were the ones that the Quran is mentioning over and over again with the view to warn the people who were rejecting the messenger that you are going to be treated likewise. Otherwise, I agree with you that one prophet who has been probably mentioned more than most others is Ibrahim alayhi salam. But the theme that I was mentioning, in line with that theme, there were 6 who were more prominent.
Okay, well, thank you. I know a lot of people want to ask a question or make a comment or observation. So I've got a note of everybody who put their hands up. Christian, I've seen your hand up going, and Tofi, and Andreas Sab, I'm going to add you to it, and Christian. But I've got the order in which it came. Lawrence next, actually.
Dr. Khalid, I very much want your conclusion to be the conclusion that everybody accepts. But you are saying to those who interpret the Quran in an aggressive way that you are making the Quran into a contradiction. Now, by the same logic, you could do it the other way round, that the militaristic interpretation could say to you, peaceniks, you are making the contradiction in the Quran. I think to succeed, you need to go a pace or two further than you have done this morning. In my faith, there is a degree of hierarchy of what we take from the Bible, so that when we say that God is love, and that people who love are in God and God is in them, that is one of the texts by which we will interpret many others. When Jesus gives us his summary of the law, love God and love your neighbor, we will make that, I think, I don't know all Christians will agree with me, but you will make that a statement which has a higher level of validity than some other things. So that if we come across something in the Christian Bible which seems to suggest that we are allowed to hate or we are allowed to murder, we say, well, this can't be the correct interpretation of those texts, because the overriding belief is that God is love, and that we are told to love and to turn the other cheek. So I'm suggesting to you that there may be a hierarchy of surah in a sense, because some are general and universal, and others are specific and on a single occasion. I think that other argument you use is not sufficiently weighty to achieve your objective.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. Yeah, that was very interesting contribution here. And just adding on to that, I think I'm going to ask one or two other people to
Okay.
speak as well before I ask you to come back in again. Is the role of, you might call the sort of, if you like, the wider law of the land, as it were, context as well, in which we can't have a situation, can we? Or can we have a situation, I don't know, I hope we can't, in which the individuals decide, based on their own sort of particular version of belief, that they're going to go around judging people and saying who's got the right to live and who's got the right to die, or whatever, etc. You have to respect the laws of the country in which may be framed in entirely different principles. First, which had nothing or very much to do with religion, or may have something to do with religion, and largely to do with secular principles and so on. Okay. Dr. Afzal Ashraf, please, next.
Dr. Zaheer, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. I think I come from a slightly similar position to Lawrence, and that I think I'd like to, if I may, challenge one of your central assumptions about what the truth of Islam. You've said that the conflicts, the violence that the Holy Prophet ﷺ was involved in along with his companions was primarily to inflict punishment, divine retribution. I think that interpretation may partly explain that many people feel that they can apply that thinking to the contemporary world, because to not do so is to accept, in their minds, a compromise. And you can't accept a compromise in your faith because it's weakness of faith. And that's the arguments that they put forward. I've read their arguments fairly extensively, that people like you say, well, it was in a different context. You will be much more familiar than I am, with Maulana Maududi, who famously wrote in his book that when all peaceful means of persuasion failed, the Prophet took to the sword. And that is the argument that they present. My argument is that all those conflicts were always defensive in the context of freedom of faith, and I can quote the relevant surahs if you wish, and that if it had been
as you suggest, some form of divine retribution, then at the point at which the Prophet was at his political peak, when he had power, when he returned to Mecca, he would not have walked into Mecca with his head, or ridden into Mecca with his head bowed and forgave everybody, because if it was divine retribution, it wasn't his authority to forgive, and that you wouldn't have had generations of Muslims embrace and live with non-Muslims. We would have had the same situation in the Middle East and Muslim lands that we have in Western Europe, where there is virtually no single community that has had an uninterrupted existence since before Christianity, whereas in Syria, even in Pakistan, there's huge problems with bigotry. There are pagan faith, there are Christians and others. So the point I make is this, that the interpretation that you put on it is potentially, I think, well, certainly doesn't agree with my study of Islam, and potentially